You're watching DW News, coming to you live from Berlin. Dozens are dead in Gaza City after Israeli troops opened fire near a crowd waiting for food. The Gaza Health Ministry says some 700 other people were injured in the incident. But there are conflicting reports of what happened and how people died. Also coming up on our show today, Vladimir Putin warns NATO over Ukraine. In his annual address, the Russian president hints nuclear weapons could be used if NATO countries send troops to Ukraine. Warnings of Russian interference in Moldova's breakaway region of Transnistria. Pro-Russia separatists there ask Moscow for help, claiming discrimination by Moldova's pro-Western government. And fears of Russian meddling in Poland as well. Authorities accuse Moscow of infiltrating the massive farmers' protests that are disrupting Poland and straining ties with neighboring Ukraine. I'm Claire Richardson. Welcome. Health officials in Gaza say more than 100 people have been killed after Israeli soldiers opened fire near a crowd waiting for a humanitarian aid delivery in Gaza City. Hamas, widely designated as a terrorist group, runs the Gaza Health Ministry. And officials there say more than 700 others were injured in the incident. Israeli officials say most of those killed died in a crush to get aid. But they have also acknowledged that as the aid convoy moved further north, troops fired warning shots and fired at people's legs, believing that the crowd gathered around the convoy posed a threat. Israel's army denies responsibility in the deadly Gaza aid incident.
No IDF strike was conducted towards the aid convoy. I want to repeat that. No IDF strike was conducted towards the aid convoy. On the contrary, the IDF was there conducting a humanitarian operation to secure the humanitarian corridor and allow the aid convoy to reach its designated distribution point so that the humanitarian aid could reach Gazan civilians in the north that are in need.
Let's speak to journalist Sami Sokol joining us from Jerusalem. Sami, we have conflicting versions of events here. What can you tell us about what has happened?
Yeah, well, I think maybe the important part is actually the fact that the Israel Defense Forces, they admitted opening fire at a crowd. They said that there was a tank and soldiers that opened fire at the Palestinians. They were unarmed. If they would have been armed, we would have heard about it. So we're talking about opening fire towards a group of unarmed Palestinians. And they say that the distance between this force and these Palestinians was tens of meters. So they weren't that close. Nevertheless, the IDF said that they posed a threat. So these soldiers, we're talking about around 4 o'clock. It was dark. It was night conditions. They felt that they were under threat. They opened fire. And they claim that they only hit 10. But when we go to a Shifa hospital, we see that the numbers, of course, are much higher. So I think if you would want to investigate, you would have to go to Shifa and see how many were wounded from that shooting.
And we are just looking now at footage released by the IDF of the events. For you, Sami, how much does this underscore what the White House has called the dire humanitarian needs in Gaza? Can you tell us what the situation is like there currently?
Well, the situation is not less than a catastrophe. We have heard the account of 6 infants that died from malnutrition and diarrhea. We know that people have been living from animal feed. In some places there is food, but the prices are so high because of the shortage. So people cannot afford buying the basic food. And no doubt that food has to reach the Gaza Strip not only from the south, like these trucks, but also from the north. And since Israel is now occupying the northern part of the Gaza Strip for a few months, it should be taking responsibility for the well-being of this population, and it definitely has the possibility to let in food to these areas.
And this latest incident in Gaza City, Joe Biden, the U.S. president, has said that this will further complicate efforts to reach a ceasefire. In your view, have the prospects of a deal deteriorated here once again?
Yes, for sure. Because throughout the Middle East, the images that come from a Shifa hospital, from the bodies that were carried away from the scene on donkey carts, are circulating on all the media, all the television stations. There's a lot of anger in the Arab world. We've heard very strong language from Jordan and Egypt, saying that they condemn the Israeli massacre. Also, Saudi Arabia has used very, very strong language. And in these circumstances, there is a lot of anger towards Israel. And this will definitely make these talks in Doha, in Qatar, more difficult. The atmosphere has become polluted by this incident.
Well, thank you so much for providing us with that context. That is Sami Sokol joining us from Jerusalem. Now, 2 Israelis have been killed in a shooting near a settlement in the occupied West Bank. Israel's military said the alleged gunman was killed by security forces after opening fire at a gas station. Violence between Palestinian settlers and the Israeli army has spiked in the West Bank since the start of the war in Gaza. We do want to bring you up to speed now with some other world news headlines. The editor-in-chief of the independent Russian newspaper Novaya Gazeta has been detained and fined in Moscow. The paper said Sergei Sokolov has been accused of discrediting Russia's military. Sokolov took charge of the paper in September 2023 when his predecessor was named a foreign agent by the Russian authorities. A prominent opposition politician has been killed in the Central African nation of Chad. The country's state prosecutor says Yaya Dillo died on Wednesday during an army assault on his party's headquarters. There has been unrest in Chad ahead of a presidential election set for May and June. And allies of Alexei Navalny say Russian authorities are blocking their efforts to bury him. The opposition leader died in prison on February 16th, and his funeral is set for Friday. Navalny's supporters say funeral directors have received threats and that they cannot hire a hearse to transport his body. Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned NATO countries that they risk nuclear war if they send troops to Ukraine. He made the threat as he delivered his annual State of the Nation address ahead of an election in which he is the only serious candidate. Now, Putin went on to say that he would be stationing more soldiers in Russia's west, close to new NATO members Finland and Sweden.
Vladimir Putin has given his annual State of the Union address just 2 weeks before the presidential election. Despite facing no meaningful opposition, he announced social reforms and a €10 billion overhaul of Russia's healthcare system. But the war in Ukraine still dominates. Earlier this week, the French President Emmanuel Macron refused to rule out the West sending troops to Ukraine, prompting a stark warning from Putin.
They should eventually understand that we also have weapons, and they know it. I just said it now myself, weapons that can hit targets on their territory. Everything that the West is coming up with now, what they threaten the world with, it can result in a conflict with the use of nuclear weapons, and therefore the destruction of civilization.
Some other NATO countries, including Lithuania, have backed the French position. But the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, has rejected any idea of direct NATO involvement in the war in Ukraine.
NATO is not and will not be party to the war. That remains the case. We do not want Russia's war against Ukraine to become a war between Russia and NATO. We agree on this with all our allies. This also means no German participation in the war.
And with no sign of any let-up in the war, and Putin heading for a quarter of a century in power, relations between Russia and the West are likely to remain tense for the foreseeable future.
How seriously should we take Putin's threats of nuclear war? I asked DW's Eastern Europe editor, Roman Goncharenko.
Well, I think we should take everything that comes from Vladimir Putin seriously, especially when it comes to threats like today. On the other hand, there is no immediate threat of a nuclear conflict between Russia and NATO. So what he was saying is just be careful what you do, but he's been saying this before. Other Russian politicians, like the former President Medvedev, has been threatening that nearly just every couple of weeks. Why it's important? It's important because this signal came from Macron, this suggestion. This is something new. Russia probably didn't expect it. But I think most important is signaling or threatening the West with a nuclear war. The Russian president, the Russian authorities are trying to stop the West from helping Ukraine. And this intimidation, it works to a certain extent because there are certain types of weapons, like long-range missiles, that the West is not ready to deliver.
So it sounds like you think this does indeed raise the stakes for the West as it considers how much support to continue providing Ukraine.
Well, it's really hard to tell if it really raises the stakes. I'm skeptical about it because it's not really new what he has been saying. What is new is the suggestion of Macron, but this is President Macron. But this is a theoretical question at the moment. Nobody is talking about sending troops to Ukraine in the near future. So when the conditions remain as they are in this war, there will be probably no need for the Western countries to do that. But they might change if Ukraine starts losing. Anyway, the stakes are relatively high as well at this moment anyway, because Russia is waging a conventional war with an open end and is not going to stop. And this was the signal by President Putin.
So if no one is talking about this seriously at this point, why did we then hear German Chancellor Olaf Scholz there go out of his way to make it very clear that no German troops would participate in fighting in Ukraine?
Well, the obvious reason is because President Macron brought it up. So Scholz had to respond. There is an unofficial rivalry between Germany and France in Europe as two major economic and military powers. So Scholz had to respond, but he's not the only one. Just remember, President Biden of the United States also has ruled out several times sending troops to Ukraine. So why Scholz and Biden do this, and other European politicians as well? Because this is dangerous, and Chancellor Scholz has said it as well many times. So nobody wants a direct confrontation between Russia and NATO. So everybody is very, very careful. But that's why. And some experts also believe that Scholz's remarks might have something to do with the coming elections in Germany and in Europe, to the European Parliament and some regional elections in Germany. And this idea of Scholz, no troops, this of course resonates with parts of German public, not only in Germany, but in other parts of Europe and the world. So nobody wants this war to escalate. And some experts believe that this could be an attempt by Scholz also to maybe use it in the future election campaign, because his party is not doing well in the polls.
Well, thank you so much for providing that context for us. That is our Eastern Europe editor, Roman Goncharenko. And Ukraine is warning against, quote, destructive external interference in Moldova's breakaway region of Transnistria. That is after pro-Russia separatists there ask Moscow for so-called protection. The self-proclaimed republic is a tiny sliver of land located between Ukraine and Moldova. It broke away from Moldova during the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Most of the territory is Russian-speaking, and many hold Russian citizenship. Tensions between Moldova and Russia have been rising ever since Moscow launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine.
Tiraspol, the capital of Transnistria. On the surface, all appears calm. This despite appeals from officials here for protection from Russia. Meanwhile, in the Moldovan capital, there's nervousness.
I'm afraid that the war will start here too. Moldova is a weak country from the point of view of the military. We have no resources. We probably will receive help from other countries, but I don't think it will help us at all, because we're not even in the European Union.
The authorities in Transnistria are practically deciding the fate of Moldova by addressing Putin and the State Duma with a request to be accepted into Russia. This, in fact, is a declaration of war against the Republic of Moldova.
In Russia, President Vladimir Putin made no mention of Transnistria in his annual State of the Nation address. However, his foreign ministry spokesperson did comment on speculation Russia was planning to annex the territory inside Moldova.
NATO is stubbornly trying to turn the republic into literally a second Ukraine, contrary to the mood of the majority of the Moldovan population and in general, apparently without thinking about the consequences of this for the country and for the region as a whole.
But NATO insists Russia is meddling.
Russia is using all the levers of influence at its disposal to stop the European path of the Republic of Moldova. It is obvious. Transnistria is a form of pressure on Moldova. It is a political declaration to inflame the pre-electoral climate in Moldova.
Speaking at a summit of leaders from southeastern Europe, the Moldovan president tried to reassure her fellow citizens and called for solidarity with neighbouring Ukraine.
Moldova is safe today. Ukraine needs to be supported. Ukraine is keeping us today peaceful and safe.
A hopeful message in a country overshadowed by the proximity of its neighbour Russia.
I spoke earlier to Mircea Barbu, a freelance journalist in Moldova who was in Transnistria today. He spoke to people there about these latest events.
The people in Transnistria expressed their feelings of hope up until this morning, up until the speech from Moscow. They were quite excited about yesterday's vote, and they feel, as they say, quote, harassed and oppressed by the regime in Chisinau. And this is due to the economic taxation reforms imposed by Chisinau. So basically, every Transnistrian business now has to pay VAT to Moldova, a thing they haven't done for the past 3 decades. So this is basically the root of this problem, if you will. Also, they feel like they have been neglected by Chisinau, and the Russian identity is not protected enough or not sustained enough in Moldova.
And are there concerns from Moldovans about this appeal from pro-Russian separatists to Moscow?
Of course, everyone here in Chisinau that I spoke with throughout the day expressed their concern, expressed their worries that a possible secession from Transnistria, a possible declaration of independence or to join Russia or to ask for protection from Russia as they voted yesterday could flare up the tension. Now, you have to remember the Transnistrians and the Moldovans fought in the early 90s in a very short but intense and emotionally deeply wounded conflict here in 1991, 1992, when both sides fought, and that's when Transnistria appeared as a self-proclaimed republic. So there's still a generation who remembers that, and another generation who grew up in the shadow of that war. So obviously everyone is worried, not to mention the fact that they see what's happening in Ukraine, in a neighboring country, and they feel that Russia is getting closer and closer to Chisinau with every day, with every declaration, with every intent of protecting, as they say, the Russian identity in Moldova.
So in your view, what are the chances of a larger regional conflict here?
Well, short term, I don't think what happened yesterday in Tiraspol could ignite a war, if you ask me. That's because logistics is very hard. Russia, at the moment, cannot send more troops into Moldova or into Transnistria, better said. Transnistria has a border with Ukraine that's been shut since month 2 or month 3 of the war. And also, the only way to gain access is through the airport if they engage in some sort of special operation. But the Moldovans have already, as they claim, unfoiled a couple of coup attempts throughout last year. So at the moment, I cannot see myself a possibility of escalating into a full-fledged war. But at the same time, you have to remember that in Transnistria, you have almost 2,000 Russian troops, the so-called peacekeepers who are there. And Moldova doesn't have an army that's well prepared, well trained to face even a small contingent of Russian troops at the moment. And that could always flare up. Also, we've seen in Ukraine Putin's preferred method of engaging in this war in Ukraine is through missiles and drones, and that's always a danger to Moldova, who has a very little to no air defense system at the moment.
Mircea Barbu in Moldova for us. Thank you so much for that update. And we can take a look now at some other stories making headlines around the world. The U.S. Supreme Court has agreed to decide whether Donald Trump is immune from prosecution. It is a victory for him as it delays his trial on charges that he conspired to overturn the 2020 election. Trump's lawyers argue he shouldn't be prosecuted for actions taken while he was president. New lawmakers have been sworn into Pakistan's parliament. It is the first time the National Assembly has met since an election 3 weeks ago that was marred by allegations of vote rigging. The new government is facing an economic crisis and security concerns. And Juventus star Paul Pogba has been banned from football for 4 years. The midfielder tested positive for testosterone after a match last August. 30-year-old Pogba says the Italian anti-doping tribunal's verdict is wrong and that he plans to appeal. He won the World Cup with France in 2018. Farmers have been protesting for weeks against EU policies in countries across Europe. Some of the biggest protests have been in Poland, where farmers are also angry over cheaper food imports from neighboring Ukraine. Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk met with leaders of farmer groups on Thursday. Tusk told them he would negotiate some EU regulations on climate change that the farmers say unfairly impacts them. He also would not rule out closing the border to imports from Ukraine. Now, that issue has been straining relations between Warsaw and Kiev, which have been close partners since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. DW's Christine Mundwa now reports from Poland.
We're in Grójecko-Warecki, 60 kilometers outside of Warsaw. People from this region like to think of it as Europe's biggest orchard. Mateusz Dabrowski's family has been growing apples here for a century.
Here we grow different variety of apples, like Gala, Golden Delicious, or Champion.
But business is tough these days, and Mateusz is unhappy about EU rules aimed at addressing climate change and the cheaper agricultural imports from Ukraine that are coming into the Polish market.
As a Polish farmer, speaking for myself, when it comes to the Green Deal and all this bureaucracy and the actions of the European officials, I'm certainly concerned, and one could even say more than concerned.
Anger over these issues has been growing in Poland. It's seen farmers block traffic from Ukraine at the borders. And this week, they staged this big demonstration in Warsaw.
One of our main points is to try and stop the import of food products from Ukraine. This is the first and the most important point. Unfortunately, the government doesn't want to talk to us. That's why we came to Warsaw. We want to show the power of the Polish farmers.
The farming community has been mobilizing online. Mateusz is on Facebook groups with other farmers in his region and beyond. But the government says it is on alert over possible Russian infiltration in the process through social media.
I'm sure that Putin and his people are very active in Europe, and they take advantage of such protests. It's enough to take your phone and start reading comments on the platform X or Facebook. Even on my own phone, I see how many comments are made by the fake accounts.
Independent observers are also concerned.
What Russian propaganda does in our countries, Poland included, is they are infiltrating our narrative. our social media, our public discussion and public debate, putting into it radical statements which play with our emotions.
Authorities are investigating some anti-Ukraine and pro-Russia slogans that have been spotted in recent demonstrations. Mateusz says those are not his fellow farmers.
Certainly, no Polish farmer who cares, as I believe, will make demands that directly attack Ukraine and support Putin.
Atakują bezpośrednio Ukrainę czy wspierają Putina.
Poland has been one of Ukraine's biggest backers in the EU, but the issue with the farmers is causing tensions between Kyiv and Warsaw.
And changing gears, we have a success story from snowy Scandinavia. Scientists in Norway have boosted the numbers of rare Arctic foxes. Climate change had left the endangered species struggling to find enough to eat in the wild. The population was down to around just 40, but feeding stations have lifted the count to more than 500. Without the program, the animals were facing extinction, but the researchers warn that it is still too early to say that the species has been saved. Now, just before we go, let's get a reminder of our top stories at this hour. The Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza says more than 100 people have been killed in a crowd waiting for an aid delivery. Israeli officials say most of those killed died in a crush to get aid, but they have also acknowledged that troops fired their weapons, believing some in the crowd posed a threat. And Russian President Vladimir Putin has warned NATO countries they risk nuclear war if they send troops to Ukraine. In his annual State of the Nation address, Putin also said Russia would station more troops in the West in response to NATO enlarging to include Finland and Sweden. And that is your news update at this hour. Stay with us, though. I will be back in just a few moments to guide you through the day. I'm Claire Richardson from me and the whole team. Thank you so much for watching.